The gate was already open when Nara arrived, and that should have felt like a welcome except that no one had opened it for her. The wind had pushed it. She could tell by the way it swung, loose and unhurried, the kind of movement that belonged to something left unlatched for long enough that everyone nearby had simply stopped noticing. She stood at the entrance of the Black Crest compound with her one suitcase set on the gravel and the official documents folded twice in her coat pocket, and she had the specific feeling of a person who has traveled 6 hours by road only to arrive at a place that was expecting her and had, somehow, already forgotten the fact. The compound stretched before her in the gray afternoon like something built with great confidence, and now carrying the weight of that confidence without quite the same energy. The perimeter wall ran long and solid in both directions. Inside it she could see the upper floors of the main building, the roofline of a second structure to the north that looked like it might be a training facility, and the edge of a third building near the far wall with a light burning inside despite the afternoon hour. The sky above all of it was the particular gray of the northern region in early spring, the kind of gray that is not threatening but is not promising either, the gray of a sky that has not yet made a decision about the day. She was 23 years old. She was Omega-born, which was a category that had followed her since birth, with the persistence of a shadow, stretching and compressing depending on who was looking and from which angle. She had been selected as a bride for the Alpha King of Black Crest because she was the only eligible Omega the Northern Council could find on 6 weeks' notice after the original candidate withdrew without explanation from the arrangement. She had read the official letter 3 times, not because the words were difficult, but because she wanted to understand the full weight of what was being asked before she agreed to it. The math was straightforward. 2 packs were on the edge of a conflict that would cost lives. An alliance marriage was the solution the treaty allowed for. She was available, she was Omega-born, and she was 23, and those 3 facts made her, by the Council's calculation, qualified. She had agreed. She had not cried about it. Crying about arithmetic was a form of arguing with it, and she had never been comfortable with that particular kind of arrogance. She had packed her suitcase with the economy of someone who had learned to keep what was necessary and release what was not. 1 week of clothing, the heavier coat that had been her mother's, and still kept its shape from her mother's shoulders in a way that felt like company, a collection of small practical items she never traveled without, and at the bottom, wrapped in old cloth, the book with no writing on its spine. The book went everywhere she went. It had since the morning 8 months ago when she stood in her mother's empty house with it in her hands, and understood that the woman who had given her the instruction it contained was no longer alive to receive her obedience, and that the instruction had now passed into her own custody, which was different. A guard noticed her after 4 minutes. He came across the gravel from his post with the deliberate, unhurried pace of someone who has made a career decision about not signaling urgency, and he looked at her face, and then at her suitcase, and then at the documents she was already holding out before he reached her. He took the papers without a word, scanned them with the efficiency of a man who has processed many documents and found very few of them interesting. She told him her name. She stated her purpose in 2 sentences. He handed back the documents. He said, "Wait here." He walked away. She waited. While she waited, she looked at the ground, not at the compound, not at the people in her peripheral vision, not at the sky. She looked at the ground, because looking at the ground gave her eyes something to do, while the rest of her attention worked. The grass along the inner base of the compound wall was brown at the tips, not the clean, honest brown of a season change, not the clear, specific brown of frost damage. This was a different shade, a particular lightless, matte brown that she had seen in other places, in other territories, on the edges of problems that lived deeper than the surface. The brown of roots that had been cut off from something essential, the brown of a system that was receiving less than it needed to sustain what was above it. She crouched. She pressed 2 fingers to the soil just inside the gate, between the old stones of the entrance and the inner grass, and she held them there. The ground was dry, not the dry of a dry season, not the dry that rain would fix. Dry in the way of something that had been severed from its source, the way a branch dries after the tree it grew from has stopped sending what it needs. She counted 3 seconds and then stood back up and was standing composedly with her suitcase at her side when the guard returned with a young woman behind him. The woman was Petra, and she was good at her job, which was the management of arrivals and the particular silences that arrivals created. She offered to carry the suitcase. Nara declined with enough warmth that it was not a refusal. They walked into the compound and Petra talked, which was what Petra did, and what she said was informative in the category of things that were officially relevant, which was to say, it told Nara very little about the things that were not officially being talked about. The binding ceremony was in 4 days. The king was occupied with matters that Petra described briefly and moved past. The formal introduction would take place at the welcome dinner in 2 days' time. The East Wing had been prepared. An orientation was scheduled for the morning. Nara listened. She also watched. She watched the buildings as they moved between them. Old and solid and built to last, maintained in the way of things cared for by people who were now doing it with slightly less than they had before. The maintenance keeping up, but only just. She watched the pack members they passed. A woman in her 40s moving through the interior courtyard with the deliberate, careful gait of someone whose energy was slightly below the demand placed upon it. 2 men near the training ground speaking in the low voices of people managing a shared problem they had not yet named to each other. She catalogued all of it with the quiet, automatic precision of someone who has been doing this for long enough that it no longer requires a decision to do it. The children were in the far courtyard to the left as they passed. 3 of them, the youngest group, doing what children in a courtyard do, running and being loud and treating the space as entirely theirs. She watched them because children were the most honest indicators of a system's health. They did not perform wellness the way adults learned to. They carried what they were actually carrying, openly and without strategy. The smallest one, a boy who looked to be about 6, stopped mid-run. Both feet stopped completely. He put his palm flat against his chest, fingers spread, and he pressed it there and stood still for the count of 3. Then he shook his head, in the small dismissing way of someone shaking off a thought that landed wrong, and he ran again, and the moment was over, and the other children had not noticed it at all. Nara had noticed it. She looked away before Petra could see her looking. Her room was clean and plain and suited her. Bed, desk, a window that faced east. The window was the thing that mattered. From a specific angle, leaning slightly left and tilting her head, she could see a thin band of water in the distance, between the tree line and the slope of the eastern boundary. A river. She stood at that window for a long time after Petra left. The river was wrong. Not visibly alarming, not obviously wrong to a person who had not been taught to look, but she had been taught to look, had been taught since she was old enough to be taught, and the river in the distance was wrong in the specific way of water that had stopped participating in what water is supposed to participate in. Healthy water, connected water, water that is living in the way of land-bound things that are connected to their root systems, plays with the light that falls on it, throws it back, takes part in the exchange. This water was absorbing the light. The light fell on it and went in and did not return, and from where she stood, she could see this clearly in the specific flat, unreflective quality of the surface. She looked at the river until the afternoon light shifted, and she could no longer see it clearly in the gray of the sky. Then she turned and unpacked her suitcase in the methodical way she always did, which gave her hands something to do while her mind worked. She placed the blank-spined book on the desk for a moment, looked at it, then put it under the false bottom of the suitcase, which was where it lived when it was not being read, which was where her mother had always kept it, and where Nara kept it, for the same reason she kept all of her mother's habits that had been given for reasons. She sat on the edge of the bed in her mother's coat and looked at the floor of the room. She was here for a treaty. She was here for an arrangement that was made without her input and which she had agreed to, because refusing it would have been arguing with a situation that needed addressing, and she was not the kind of person who argued with situations that needed addressing simply because the addressing was uncomfortable. She understood all of this clearly. She had no quarrel with any of it. The brown grass was wrong. The river was wrong. The boy had pressed his hand to his chest and gone still in the middle of running. Outside her window, somewhere across the compound, a gate was doing something loose and unhurried. She could hear it through the glass, the slow, uncertain swing of something that had not been properly secured, moving in whatever direction the wind directed it. She turned the lamp on. She opened her mother's book to the 3rd chapter. She read until the light outside the window was fully gone and the lamp was the only light in the room. Then she set the book aside and lay down in the dark. She was going to be polite at the dinner. She was going to give nothing away before she had confirmed what she already suspected. She was going to do this correctly and in order, which was the only way her mother had ever done anything and the only way she had been taught to work. But she was already mapping the compound. She was already holding the brown grass and the river and the boy's small hand pressed flat and the dry soil at the gate, and the map they made together was taking shape in the part of her mind that worked while she slept. And by morning she would know more than she knew now, and by the end of the orientation tomorrow she would know considerably more than that. The gate swung somewhere outside, slow and unmanned, and moving in whatever direction it was directed. She was going to find the right direction. She closed her eyes. The 11th day without proper sleep had a particular texture that Alaric had begun to recognize, the way you recognize the features of a road you have driven too many times. The 2 to 3 in the morning rotation, the same small cluster of facts cycling without producing new conclusions. The specific weight behind his eyes that occupied the same location as pain without being precisely that. The way lamplight looked in his study in those hours, too bright in all the wrong ways. He had grown familiar with all of it over the past 11 days, and familiarity had not made it easier. Familiarity with a difficulty is not the same as a solution to it. He was at his desk the night before the welcome dinner, reading the same page of the same report he had been reading for 3 days, when Cole knocked and came in. Cole had been his beta for 4 years, and had known him for considerably longer than that, and he had the ease of someone who decided long ago that most social distances were unnecessary, and had been operating without them ever since. Cole took the chair across the desk, which was his chair, the way the desk was Alaric's desk, and he said, "She arrived this afternoon. I have what I could find." Alaric put down the report. The council sent a file. 2 paragraphs. The council sent 2 paragraphs and called it sufficient documentation for a binding arrangement. Cole looked at him with the expression of a man who has been thinking about something for several hours and has decided the time for sharing it has arrived. Her name is Nara Voss, 23. The Voss Pact territory was small and got absorbed into the Eastern Alliance 5 months ago, which means she does not have a home pack anymore, in any practical sense. Her mother died 8 months back. Before that they kept to themselves on the edge of the old Voss grounds, living quietly in the way that means deliberately rather than by circumstance. Alaric waited. "She is not on the Omega register," Cole said. "Neither was her mother before her. The council found her through a cross-reference of the old treaty documents, because that is the only system where she appeared at all. To not be on the Omega register takes effort. It is not an oversight. It is a choice made and maintained over time." He paused. "She worked as a landkeeper for 3 years after her mother's health began to decline. 2 different pack territories. Good records from both. The phrase that appears in both hiring notes is specific feeling for the ground." Alaric looked at him. "A feeling for the ground," Cole said again. "The ability to read land health and soil condition, and the connection between territory and pack, at an instinctive level. Some people have it naturally. It is considered useful in landkeeping work." He leaned forward slightly. The guard at the east gate said she stood at the entrance for 4 minutes before he reached her. He said she crouched down at some point and put her fingers in the soil at the base of the gate. He said, and this is the specific phrase he used, she looked like she was reading it. The study was quiet. Outside the windows, the compound had gone to its nighttime state. The lamplight was too bright. Alaric looked at it for a moment. He thought about the river. He had been thinking about the river for 6 weeks, which was the same amount of time it had been wrong. He had not spoken about the river to anyone, Not to Cole, not to the outside consultants who had come and gone without a clear answer, not to Dot, his lead healer, who had the most complete picture of what was happening to his pack. He had not spoken about it because he did not have accurate language for what was wrong with it. Wrong was not a clinical term. Wrong was not something he could put in a report. He observed it on his morning runs, and he noted it in his private records, and he kept looking for the language that would make it communicable, and in 6 weeks he had not found it. A woman had arrived that afternoon and crouched at the gate and put her fingers in the soil. He did not say what he was thinking. The thought was not yet formed enough to say. "Keep finding out what you can," he said. "I'll meet her at the dinner tomorrow." Cole stood. "You look like the last 11 nights all in one face." "That's accurate." "Sleep, Alaric." He did not sleep. He lay down at midnight, and the dark of the room was the particular dark of too much time awake, which has textures that ordinary dark does not, and after an hour he got up and went back to the study. He sat at the desk with the report he could not get further into, and he thought about what Cole had said. A feeling for the ground. The guard's description. She looked like she was reading it. He had been looking at everything except the ground. He thought about that. He had commissioned reports on bond sickness patterns. He had consulted 2 outside healers who had written careful documents that described possibilities rather than certainties. He had written to neighboring alphas. He had cross-referenced the pack census data against the symptom reports. He had done every correct thing in the correct order and had not found the answer, and the thought that kept returning in the rotation of 2 to 3 in the morning was, correct things, wrong direction. He had been looking at his people and not at what was underneath them. Owen was 6 years old, and he had been the first to develop symptoms and the most consistently affected. And Alaric had sat with him twice in the healer's building, and both times had been able to offer nothing except his presence. He believed in the value of presence. He had always believed it. But there was a gap between believing in what presence offers and feeling it as sufficient, and the gap had been widening for 11 days. He fell asleep eventually in the chair, which was not his intention but which his body apparently felt was its prerogative. He woke at 6 with a stiff neck and went to the healer's building before breakfast to check on Owen. Owen was the same as the previous day. Not worse, not better, the same. He ate. He performed his morning duties with the focused attention he gave all his duties regardless of his own condition, because the duties did not care about his condition, and neither did the people who depended on the duties being done. He reviewed reports and delegated tasks and moved through the day with the competence of habit, while the back of his mind held its private rotation. By the time the welcome dinner arrived, he had a direction forming. Loose and unsupported, not ready to speak aloud, but pointing somewhere. He had not shared it with Cole because he did not share incomplete things. The dinner was in the long room of the main hall, 8 of them at the table, Cole and his partner, 2 senior pack members, Petra, Dot, and his arranged bride, who was standing at the far end of the room when he walked in, talking to Bess from the kitchen, and who did not look up when he entered. The room adjusted to him the way it always did. She did not adjust with it. She finished what she was saying to Bess. She listened to Bess's answer. She nodded. Then she turned because her conversation was complete, not because he had come in, and she looked at him across the table length of the room with the eyes of someone who has been given a file on a patient and is now reconciling that file with the person in front of them. The look lasted 2 seconds, and then she crossed the room and offered her hand in the correct formal greeting of the binding protocol, performed without hesitation or the slight extra deliberateness of someone rehearsing while performing. She had prepared. She had taken it seriously enough to prepare. He said his name was known to him. He said thank you for making the journey. She said thank you for the room, and her tone held the shape of a woman who has accepted the full dimensions of a situation and is operating inside them without apology or pretense. He had expected performance, not dishonest performance, but the particular performance that people produce when they have been trained toward a role and are demonstrating that training. The careful, managed smallness that made formal arrangements easier to navigate. He did not get any of that. He got a woman who was taking in the room the same way she had apparently taken in the gate, with a total, specific, absorbing attention that gave nothing away, because it was not performing engagement, it was actually engaged. They went to the table. Dinner moved. Conversations carried by 8 people in the way that group meals carry themselves, topics passing and returning. Nara contributed when addressed and listened to everything else with the quality of attention that he was beginning to catalog alongside his private direction. She ate steadily. She tracked the eastern boundary every time it came up in conversation, a slight additional focus that he noted. When Dot mentioned one of the affected pack members in passing, something moved in Nara's eyes that was not spoken. And then, about halfway through the meal, in a gap in the general conversation, she set down her fork and looked directly at him and said, "How long has the river on the eastern boundary been that color?" The table went quiet. He looked at her. The river, not the pack member's symptoms, not the land, the river, which was the thing he had been observing in private and not speaking about because he did not have language for what was wrong with it. She had been on his territory for 2 days. She had been in her room and on an orientation walk and at this dinner, and she had looked at the right thing from the window of her room on her first afternoon, and she had come to this table and asked the right question. 6 weeks, he said. The words were simple and direct, and they were all he had. She nodded. She reached for her glass, took a careful drink, set it back down, and looked at her plate. She did not say another word for the rest of the dinner. But the room had changed. Cole was watching her now. Dot was watching her. All 8 of them were doing the specific work of people who have just witnessed something they will discuss among themselves later, and are currently processing it without appearing to process it. He watched her for the rest of the meal, in the way he had spent years perfecting, which was to not appear to watch. He watched the way she observed everything while appearing to observe nothing. He watched her eat, efficiently and without ceremony, the way of someone fueling a process rather than performing the social dimension of a meal. He watched the small, precise movements of her attention whenever anything related to the eastern side of the territory came up, the slight heightening of focus, a card being filed. She knew something. After the dinner, she offered the formal good night and left the room with her back straight and her steps measured and her attention already somewhere ahead of where she was standing, and he stood at the window of his study for a long time after everyone had gone and looked east at the darkness where the river was, somewhere beyond the tree line, carrying its wrong quality of light absorption in the dark. She had asked about the river, the one thing he had been carrying privately, the one detail he had not put in any report, the one observation he had not been able to make communicable. She had asked about it on her second day, at a dinner table, in front of 8 people, as though it were the most natural question in the world. He was not going to sleep tonight either, but the rotation had changed. The same cluster of facts, but pointing in a new direction. A direction he had not been pointing before. East. It had always been east. He had known it was east, and had not been able to do anything with that knowledge, because knowing a direction without having the instrument to navigate it is not the same as knowing where you are. He was beginning to think he might have found the instrument. He was beginning to think she had arrived on a Tuesday with it already in her hands. On the 3rd night, a 6-year-old boy named Owen woke up crying without sound, which was the kind of crying that his mother Claire had learned was worse than the loud kind because it meant he had already worked through the first stage of it and was now in the stage after, the patient enduring stage that small children were not supposed to be in at all. Claire brought him to the healer's building at midnight. Dot was there, as Dot was usually there in the hours when the compound was sleeping, and the quiet gave Dot's particular kind of worry more room to expand. Dot looked at Owen and at Claire, and at the hour on the clock, and then she did something she would not have been able to explain fully if pressed. She sent word to Nara, not to Cole, not to Alaric, to Nara, whose room was in the east wing and who had been in the compound for 3 days and had asked about the river at the welcome dinner with the specificity of someone who already had most of the answer. Nara arrived without her boots, which told Dot she had not been sleeping either. She stood in the doorway of the side room and looked at Owen for a moment, and then she crossed the room and sat beside his cot, not at the foot of it, not across from it, but beside it, at the level of his face, in the position of someone who intends to be close to what they are doing, rather than maintaining a professional distance from it. She asked his permission before she touched him. She said, "Can I put my hand here?" and she indicated his chest. Owen looked at her with the dark, serious eyes of a child who has been attended to by several adults over recent weeks, and has developed a sense for the difference between adults who are going through the appropriate motions and adults who are actually doing something. He considered her for 3 seconds with the full weight of a 6-year-old's judgment, and then he nodded. She placed her palm flat against his sternum, fingers relaxed, and she held it there, and she closed her eyes. Dot stood at the door. She did not speak. She watched Nara's face, which had the quality of someone doing concentrated work at a depth that does not show itself on the surface except as stillness. The stillness was total and did not feel like absence. It felt like presence, concentrated beyond the usual amount. 2 minutes passed. Then Nara opened her eyes and looked at Owen, and then at Claire. "Has he been not quite finishing his meals?" she asked. "The past 2 weeks or so." Claire blinked. "Yes. I thought it was the tiredness putting him off his food. And when he sleeps, does it feel like the sleep is not reaching the tired part of him? Like he rests but comes back to the morning just as tired as he went to it?" Claire looked at Dot, and then back at Nara. "That is the exact thing I could not say to Dot. I tried twice, and I couldn't get it into the right words. That is exactly it." Nara looked at Owen. She looked at him with the specific attention of someone who is not performing reassurance, but is actually reassured, who has found what they were looking for and is now clear about the next step. "You are going to be okay," she said. "I need you to sleep now, and I will figure out the rest of it." Owen looked at her for the counting seconds of a child making a decision. Then he lay back down and closed his eyes and was asleep within minutes, which was the fastest he had fallen asleep in 2 weeks. Dot noted this without speaking. In the corridor, Nara asked for the full pattern. Who had developed symptoms first, and when, and where in the territory they had been in the days before onset. Dot had records. She had been keeping them since the 3rd case, because keeping records was what Dot did when she ran out of other things to do, and she had not run out of records to keep. They sat in Dot's office for 40 minutes. The picture was clear to Nara quickly, though she did not say so immediately. She asked 2 questions at specific points that told Dot the shape of what she was looking for, without telling her what she was actually seeing. The pattern was unmistakable when you knew what to look for. The cases running outward from the eastern boundary, the earliest affected all linked to time spent near the river, the progression inward over the weeks that followed. She thanked Dot and went to the library. Walt found her 4 books on root bond sickness. She read all 4 standing at the reference shelf, moving through them with the speed of someone using them to confirm a framework rather than build one. None of them described precisely what she was looking at. They described gradual weakening, which was a different mechanism. She asked Walt about lunar channel corruption, and he looked genuinely apologetic about not having material on that specifically, which told her the gap in the library's knowledge was real and not a filing problem. She thanked Walt and left. She stood in the corridor outside the library for a moment with the night quiet around her. Then she went back to her room, to the false bottom of the suitcase, to her mother's book. Root Sight was the name her grandmother had given it, passing it along with the instruction that the grandmother had been the last generation to use it openly. Her grandmother had lived in a smaller, simpler world, a pack territory governed by an alpha who had understood what she was and had valued it without the need to put it into a category that the existing structures could manage. That world had not survived into her mother's time. Her mother's world was more organized and more suspicious of things that did not fit the organization, and her mother had learned to keep the root site small and to keep herself smaller, and she had raised Nara inside the same discipline. Root sight was not healing. It was not the direct application of care to a symptom, which was what Dot did and what had its own value and its own limits. Root sight was perception. The ability to read the systems that existed beneath the surface of everything, the bond roots that connected a pack to its territory, at a level most people never considered because those systems had always been working without requiring their attention. The lunar channels that moved energy through the ground between root points, the living web that sustained both the land and the lives on top of it. When the web was healthy, it was invisible. When it failed, you noticed the symptoms before you found the cause. She had been noticing symptoms since the gate. She had pressed her fingers into the soil at the gate on the first day and felt what was there, and she had known then what she was in the general outline. 3 more days had confirmed the specific shape. Bond root severance. Not gradual weakening, which was the deterioration of neglect or sustained strain. A break. A clean, specific cut at a single point underground 6 weeks ago, radiating its damage outward from that point in the pattern Dot's records had shown her. The eastern boundary was where it started. The river was the closest visible indicator. The symptoms in the pack members were the damage reaching inward as the break spread. It could be repaired. Her mother's annotations in the margin of the relevant chapter were small and careful, her mother's handwriting being the handwriting of someone who treated space on the page as finite and precious. The repair required locating the precise breakpoint, which required root site of sufficient depth. It required sustained direct contact with the break, both palms on the root at the point of severance, for long enough that the connection could reseal itself. It was not dangerous in the sense of irreversible harm. It was demanding in the sense of total commitment. The concentration required pulled your awareness entirely below the surface of the world, and her mother's note said clearly, "Do not do this alone. Have someone who understands to stay close, and to bring you back if you go too deep." She read that note twice and thought about Alaric. She thought about the way he had answered her question about the river. 2 words, 6 weeks, delivered without the hesitation of someone deciding whether to share something private, but with the directness of someone who recognized a correctly asked question and gave it the answer it deserved. She thought about the way he had watched her for the rest of that dinner without appearing to watch her, which required a specific kind of training that she recognized because she had been doing the same thing. He was carrying this problem with the total commitment of someone who had not found a solution and would not stop looking until he had. He was also, she was nearly certain, looking in the wrong direction because no one had shown him the right one. She was going to show him the right one. Not tonight. Tonight she needed to find the precise location of the break, which required close proximity that her window view had not yet given her. She would spend the next 2 days mapping it. She would know exactly what she was walking into before she asked anyone to stand on a bank in the dark and watch. She set the book down. She looked at the window. The night was deep, and the river was invisible in it, but she knew where it was, and she knew what it was, and she knew what she was going to have to do about it. Her mother had spent 12 years teaching her to hide this. She had taught her with patience and repetition and with genuine love, the love of a woman who had thought carefully about the world her daughter was going to live in and had prepared her as well as she could for it. The hiding had been protection, real protection, given with full understanding of what was being protected against. Her mother was 8 months gone. Owen had pressed his hand to his chest and cried without sound. She put the book away. She set the alarm on the small clock she traveled with for 4 in the morning. She lay down. She slept, which surprised her slightly, because she had not expected sleep to come easily. She took it as a signal from a body that knew she was finally moving in the right direction and was conserving itself accordingly. At 4 she woke. She dressed in the dark with the efficiency of long practice, the heavier coat and the boots she wore in the field, and the pair of gloves she had packed, because she had known, somewhere below decision-making, that she would be putting her hands into the ground at some point. She crossed the compound in the pre-dawn quiet, where the only sounds were the wind in the eastern trees and the loose gate doing its slow, persistent swing, and she went to the river. The first morning she found the direction of the break. Not the point, the direction. She spent 2 hours following it before the light came up and the compound began to wake, and she went back with mud on her knees and a clearer map than she had started with. The second morning she went further. She was close. The specific quality of the ground changed as she moved toward the break, the way the air changes when you move toward an open window in a closed room, a pressure shift, a place where the continuous hum of connected things went momentarily silent. She was very close. She returned before the compound was fully awake. She ate breakfast and answered Petra's questions about the ceremony arrangements and gave nothing away. She had 2 days before the ceremony. She was going to use them. That evening she went back to the river with everything she needed, which was her hands and her mother's instructions, and 12 years of practice that had been kept small on purpose and was about to be used at full depth for the first time. She was not afraid of what she was about to do. She was done pretending she did not know what she was for. The night before the binding ceremony, Nara stood in the eastern river for the first time. She had found the severance point that afternoon. It was 30 meters east of the main bank, below the surface of the riverbed, at a depth that required her to put both arms into the elbow and lean forward until her face was close enough to the water that she could feel the cold of it on her cheeks. She had been there for 2 hours in the late afternoon light before she was certain, and when she was certain she had stepped back, made note of the precise markers on the bank, and gone back to the compound to eat dinner and wait for the compound to settle into its nighttime quiet. She went back at 10. The night was clear and the blood moon was 2 days out, but its approach was already in the sky, a weight of quality in the darkness that she had been taught to recognize and use. The lunar energy that ran through the ground increased in the days before the blood moon. The bond roots were more receptive to repair in that window than at any other point in the cycle. She had known this from the chapter's first paragraph and had been calculating toward it since she confirmed the break on the first morning. She left her boots on the bank in the neat alignment of someone who intends to return to them, and she waded in. The cold was serious and immediate. She was not unaware of it. She was simply committed to something that the cold could not change the necessity of, and so the cold became a fact of the work, rather than a reason to stop. She moved to the point she had marked, and put both arms below the surface, and pressed her palms flat against the riverbed. She found the break. It was not visible to anything except root sight, but to root sight it was unmistakable. A clean absence in the middle of what should have been a continuous living connection, the way a gap in a wire is unmistakable to the current that would otherwise flow through it. She had read about severance in her mother's book and in the 4 library books, and she had felt the edges of it in the orientation walk and in the 2 mornings she had spent approaching it, but finding it directly, putting her hands on it, was different from all of that. It had the quality of something that had been cut with intention, not a natural weakening or a gradual drift. Something had happened here, 6 weeks ago, and had cut this connection cleanly, and whatever had made that cut was not present anymore, which was the only fortunate thing about the situation. She began to work. Root sight in full use was a very different experience from root sight kept small. Kept small, it was a peripheral awareness, a slight additional layer of perception laid over the ordinary sensory experience of the world, the way a musician can hear a song's structure while also simply hearing the song. Full use was immersive. Full use pulled her awareness down through her hands into the ground, through the soil and the stone and the deeper levels of connected matter, until she was at the level where the bond root ran, and at that level the world above her, the cold water and the night air and the sound of the river moving around her legs, became remote and difficult to attend to. This was what her mother's note meant. This was why her mother had written, "Have someone close who understands to stay close." She had found the break, and she was holding it, both palms flat against the substrate, the root sight reaching through her hands in the way she had spent 12 years not allowing it to reach, and the world of the surface was growing quiet around her. Not gone, remote. The way a voice from another room grows remote when you are concentrating very hard on something in the room you are in. She worked. She was not healing the bond root in the way Dot healed. She was not applying energy or intention to the break the way a healer would apply care to a wound. Root sight did not work that way. Root sight worked by finding a break and holding it, making contact with both sides of the severed connection simultaneously and maintaining that contact with steady, sustained concentration until the connection's own living capacity for repair was able to activate. The root bond, like all living systems, could repair itself if the conditions were right. What she was doing was creating the conditions, holding the two sides together in the way you hold the edges of a wound together while the healing happens underneath your hands. It required patience rather than force. It required remaining exactly where she was for exactly as long as it took. She had no idea how long it would take. The chapter had been clear about that. There was no universal timeline. She would know when it was done. She worked. An hour passed inside the concentration, which meant it passed without her full awareness of its passage. The river ran around her legs. The cold had moved past the stage of discomfort into the stage of simply being the condition of the work, the background temperature against which everything else was operating. She was aware of it the way she was aware of the riverbed under her feet, as information rather than experience. And then she heard something on the bank. Footsteps. Careful, deliberate. The footsteps of someone who was moving with attention and had no intention of surprising her. She registered this and filed it without bringing it into the foreground of her concentration. She had known someone might come. She had not known who. She continued working. The footsteps stopped at the bank's edge. She could feel the presence of a person on the bank, the way you feel a presence through a wall, not seeing or hearing them exactly, but aware of the specific signature of another consciousness nearby. The presence on the bank was large and contained, and not going anywhere. It was not alarmed by her. It was watching in the patient way of someone who has decided that watching is the appropriate response to what they are seeing. She did not know how long he stood there before she registered the specific quality of the presence as his. She was deep in the work, and specific identifications were expensive when concentration was being allocated somewhere else. But at some point below the level of conscious decision, she knew that it was Alaric on the bank, and she knew he was staying, and she let that be the information it was, and kept working. Another hour. The moon had moved in her peripheral awareness, shifted in the sky she could no longer clearly see. Her arms were below the surface, and her palms were flat against the break, and she was holding the two sides of the severed connection with everything she had. She felt the break beginning to respond. This was the part she had not been fully able to prepare herself for from the chapter's description alone. The specific sensation of the bond root beginning to re-knit under her hands. It was not dramatic. It was extraordinarily subtle, the way the earliest movement of a change is always more subtle than its later stages. The two edges of the severance, which had been hard and definite and separate since 6 weeks ago when something had cut them apart, began to soften. The softening was microscopic, and she would not have felt it if she had not been holding the edges with her full attention. But she felt it, and she held it, and she continued to hold it, because the softening was the beginning and not the completion, and releasing now would undo everything. She held. She was aware, at this point, that her body on the surface had been in cold water for an extended period of time and was sending signals about this that she was not currently in a position to fully receive. She was also aware that the depth of concentration required to maintain the hold was approaching the level that her mother's note had described, the level at which the surface world stopped being accessible, and she would need something external to bring her back if she went further. She swayed. It was a single small degree of movement, her body sending its signal clearly. Enough. He was in the water before she had fully registered the movement. She felt him behind her, one large warm hand flat between her shoulder blades, steadying. She steadied. She did not turn, because turning would have required releasing the hold, and she had not finished. "Still here," he said. His voice was steady and very near and entirely without alarm. "Still here," she said back. Her voice came from far inside the concentration, but it reached the surface, and she heard it land in the air between them, and felt him accept it as the information it was meant to be. He stood behind her with his hand on her back. She went back into the work. The bond root's two edges continued their slow, painstaking approach to each other. She maintained the hold. The concentration required for this was everything she had and slightly beyond everything she had, and the fact of his hand on her back and his presence on the bank behind her was not a distraction. It was the opposite. It was the anchor that allowed her to go to the depth the work required, without losing the thread back to the surface. She had not known, before this moment, that she had been waiting for this, for someone willing to stand on the bank. She worked. The change happened at 2:47 in the morning, which she did not know because she had no access to a clock, but which Alaric did know because he had checked his watch at 2:45, and the change came after that. She felt it happen before she saw it. The two edges of the severed bond route met, not with the drama of a reunion, not with force or impact, but with the quiet, specific rightness of a connection re-established. The living system on both sides of the break recognized itself. The recognition moved through both directions simultaneously, outward from the severance point, in both directions through the root system, like a current finding a completed circuit. She felt it the way you feel a door opening somewhere in a large building, a subtle shift in the pressure of the air. She opened her eyes. The river was different. The flat, absorbing quality of the water that had been present for 6 weeks, the quality she had seen from her window on the first afternoon and had been working toward ever since, was gone. The moonlight that fell on the surface was no longer disappearing into it. The river was throwing the light back, playing with it. The water was alive again in the way that water is alive when the systems beneath it are working and the land above them is connected and the pack on top of that land is receiving what it needs to receive. She stood in the living water and looked at it. He had caught her when she swayed. His arms were around her shoulders, both of them, and she was leaning into them with a weight that told her more about how much the work had cost than she had been aware of during the work itself. She straightened, and he kept his arms where they were, and she did not ask him to move them. The word "done" was the smallest accurate statement she could make. She said it. He said it back. They waded to the bank, and she sat on the ground, and he sat beside her, not because it was required, not because it was part of any arrangement or protocol, but because it was where he was, and where she was, and because neither of them was ready to be somewhere else yet. She told him about Owen. She told him about the deer and the grass and the timeline of the recovery, and her voice had the rough, stripped-down quality of pure exhaustion, and underneath it the precision of someone who has done something specific and is reporting the result accurately. He listened. They were quiet for a long time after the reporting was done. The river ran clear beside them, and the blood moon was making its slow descent, and the night was fully committed to being cold. "You have been carrying this alone for longer than tonight," he said. She turned to look at him. His face in the moonlight was tired in the same way hers was, the tiredness of someone who has been holding a problem with both hands for too long without being able to set it down, and underneath the tiredness something that was not soft exactly, but was more open than she had seen it before. "My mother knew," she said. "She taught you." Yes. He was quiet. He was giving the information room, not pressing for more than she had offered. She noted this. "Hide it," she said, not because he had asked, but because she was suddenly tired of the thing living unexplained between them. That was the instruction she gave me. From when I was old enough to understand what she was teaching me, she had reasons, good reasons. The world she was preparing me for does not have a comfortable category for what I can do, and the things that don't fit comfortable categories get handled in ways that the people holding them usually prefer to avoid. He did not fill the silence that followed. "She was protecting me," Nara said. "She spent 12 years preparing me, and the last 6 weeks of her life finishing what she hadn't gotten to yet. And the instruction to hide was the first and the most repeated part of all of it." She looked at the river. She was not wrong to give it. "But you did not hide it." "No, because of Owen." She considered. "Because of Owen, and because of the river, and because of the grass, and because the whole compound is sitting on a land that was dying from the ground up, and nobody in it had any way to see it." She paused. "My mother was protecting me from a world that had not yet seen what I could do. The danger she was describing was the danger of being judged before being known. She looked at him. "You did not judge me before knowing me." He held her look. He did not say anything, which was the right response, because what she had said was true, and the only accurate response to a true thing is to let it be true. He pulled his coat from his shoulders and held it out. She took it. She pulled it around herself, and it covered her to the knees, and she was warm for the first time in several hours, and she let herself be warm without making anything of it. "Tell me what you need," he said. She thought about it. She was genuinely unsure, because she had been holding this alone for so long that the concept of needing something from someone else in this specific area required a moment's consideration. "I need the repair to hold," she said. "I will know by morning. I need a few days before any formal announcement of what happened, because I need to understand what the consequences are going to be." He was quiet for a moment. "No announcements," he said. She nodded. They sat on the bank until the sky at the eastern edge began its earliest, almost invisible shift towards something that was not yet light, but was no longer fully dark. Then they walked back through the tree line side by side, both of them wet and cold, and carrying the quiet of people who have just been through something together that does not require talking about. At the east wing door, she started to take the coat off. "Tonight," he said. "Keep it tonight." She stopped. She looked at him. Something in the look that was doing work she did not entirely have the vocabulary for yet, and which she decided not to try to name at 3-something in the morning, when she had not slept and had just spent 4 hours in cold water. "Okay," she said. She went upstairs. He stayed at the bottom. She could feel his presence there until she turned the corner of the landing, and then she could not feel it anymore, and she walked to her room and stood at the window and looked at the river. Clear water, moving water, water that caught the very early light and threw it back. She had done it. Her mother's voice was in her head saying, "I knew you would, when it mattered enough. I knew you would." She sat on the edge of the bed in his coat and closed her eyes, and for the first time in 4 days, she slept. Owen woke up at 6:11 in the morning, and Alaric was already in the healer's building when it happened. He had not gone back to sleep after leaving the east wing. He had stood in the center of the compound for a while, with the night finishing around him, 1 foot on the ground, feeling the difference that was now there. And then he had gone inside and made tea and sat at his study desk, not reading the reports on it, but thinking, which was something he did when the direction had changed and he needed to reorient the map to match. At 6 he had put on his coat, which was a different coat from the one he had left with Nara, and he had walked to the healer's building because that was where he wanted to be when the morning brought what he believed the morning was going to bring. Dot was already there. She looked at him when he came in and said nothing, which was the look of a woman who had been awake for a long time and had developed, in that time, a theory she was waiting to test. They waited together in the corridor outside the side room. Dot with her tea and Alaric with his. The compound outside was beginning its morning, the sounds of early activity starting at the edges of the quiet. At 6:11, Owen's voice came through the wall. It was not a cry, it was not distress. It was the voice of a child who has just discovered that something that had been missing has come back, which is the most specific kind of surprise there is, the surprise of a return rather than an arrival, and it had a quality that cut directly through the wall and the corridor and the morning quiet and into the chest of everyone within hearing. "Mom," Owen said, "it's back." Alaric stood up. He went to the doorway. Owen was sitting up in the cot with his palm flat on his chest, the gesture he had been making for weeks, but his face was entirely different. The expression of a child who had been pressing his hand to a hollow and finding hollow every time and was now pressing his hand to a hollow that had been filled. His eyes were wide and clear and not afraid. Claire was on the other side of the cot, and she was looking at Alaric over Owen's head, and her eyes were very bright, and she was not going to cry, not quite, but she was close, and she was not trying to be far. Alaric looked at the boy's face. He thought about a woman standing in cold water, with her eyes open and seeing nothing visible. He thought about the feel of her weight against his arms when she swayed and he caught her. He thought about the word done, delivered, in that rough, quiet, exhausted voice, the smallest accurate statement she could have made. He said something to Owen and something to Claire. He was not entirely certain later what exactly, because the moment was larger than his attention to the specific words. And then he went to the east wing. He knocked on her door. She opened it after a brief interval in which he heard the small specific sound of a book being set down, which told him she had not been sleeping after all, or had woken early and gone back to reading, which were different things but both of which told him something about how she processed the aftermath of large events. She was still in yesterday's clothes. She had been awake since she got back from the river. She looked at him and waited. "Owen," he said. He woke up and said, "It's back." Those exact words. Something moved through her face. A wave of something real and unprepared for and not managed, and then it passed and left her face clearer than it had been since she arrived. Not lighter, not warmer, clearer. The face of someone who has just confirmed that the thing they worked toward actually happened. "Good," she said, very quietly. "Then, tell Claire that he'll eat properly today. He's been not finishing his meals for 2 weeks. Today he'll finish." Alaric nodded. He looked at her in the doorway of her room, in his coat, with the specific tiredness of someone who has not slept and has just held a very large effort to its conclusion. He thought about the 11 days he had spent looking in the wrong direction, and about the 2 paragraphs the council had sent, and about the fact that nobody had come to the gate to meet her, and she had stood at the gate for 4 minutes, putting her fingers in the soil and beginning, already, to understand what was underneath all of it. He said, "Come and eat breakfast. You haven't eaten since yesterday afternoon." She looked at him, and the almost smile appeared. Not full, not yet, but the shape of something approaching warmth. "All right," she said. They walked to the dining room together in the early morning. The compound was in its full morning activity now, people moving through their established routines, the sounds and energies of a large group of people starting another day. Nara and Alaric moved through it together without having decided to move through it together, which was the specific kind of together that happened without a conversation about it, the kind that comes from having been in something significant side by side, and not needing to return to ordinary distances afterward. They ate. The light came in through the east windows and fell across the table between them. Clean morning light that played on the surface of things rather than disappearing into them. Nara ate steadily and looked out the window at intervals with the quiet attention of someone listening to something that was not in the room but that she was glad was present. At some point she said, not quite to him, simply aloud, "The deer will return to the eastern range by the 10th day. Watch the tree line on that side." He wrote it down on the margin of the report he had brought to breakfast, which was something he did out of habit rather than intention, and he said, "You're certain about the deer, less certain about the exact day, within 10 days. I'll watch." She nodded and went back to her food. He watched her eat and thought about what he knew about her and what he did not know yet, which was the larger share. He knew she had arrived with 1 suitcase, and her mother's coat, and a book with no title on its spine that she had been hiding and was no longer hiding, at least from him. He knew she had been selected for this arrangement not for any quality she possessed, but for the simple fact of her availability, which was a way of being selected that he was going to think carefully about and had not yet finished thinking about. He knew she had put her fingers in the soil at his gate on the first day and had been reading what was underneath his compound ever since, quietly and without announcement, and had found the thing that 11 days and every resource he had could not find. He did not know why she had agreed to come. He did not know what she had left behind, what the small quiet life on the edge of the old Voss grounds had been like, what it had cost her to pack 1 suitcase and get in a truck. He did not know the specifics of what her mother had taught her, and over how long and in what order, or what the 3 years of landkeeping work had been like, or what she had seen in other territories that she had fixed quietly and moved on from. He did not know any of the things that made a person rather than a profile, and he was going to find them out, and he was not in a hurry about it. which was itself something he noted. He was not usually patient with the pace at which information arrived. After breakfast, he went to find Owen. Owen was in the courtyard. He was running. He was running the way children run when nothing is stopping them, with the specific careless joy of a body that is not monitoring itself because it does not need to, that is simply moving because moving is good, and everything is working, and the world is the right size. He ran from one end of the courtyard to the other and back, and his hand did not go to his chest. He ran, and he did not stop. Alaric stood at the edge of the courtyard and watched him run. He stood there for a long time. Then he went to find Cole. Cole was in his office, which was a smaller, less formal room than Alaric's study, organized according to Cole's system, which was inscrutable to everyone else, and apparently perfectly clear to Cole. He looked up when Alaric came in, and Alaric sat down in the chair across the desk, which was not his chair but he sat in it anyway, and he said, "I need to tell you what happened last night." Cole put down the paper he had been reading. He gave him his full attention. Alaric told him. He told him about finding her in the river, about standing on the bank, about the 4 hours, and the water, and the moment at 2:47 when the river changed. He told him about the coat, and the walk back through the tree line, and Owen waking up at 6:11 saying it's back. He told him all of it with the same directness he told Cole everything, because Cole was the person he told things to directly, and because he was not yet sure what any of it meant, and he needed to say it in the order it had happened before he could think about what it meant. Cole listened to all of it without speaking. Then he said, "She repaired the bond route." "Yes. From inside the river. She found the severance point there. She said it was 30 meters east of the bank." Cole was quiet for a moment. "Did you know that she could do this when she arrived?" "No." "Did anyone know?" "Her mother. Her mother knew, and she apparently spent the last 12 years making very sure nobody else did." Cole nodded slowly. He looked at the surface of his desk for a moment, the look of a man processing something that requires reorganization of several existing frameworks. "And now?" "Now Owen is running in the courtyard without stopping, and the river is running clear." Alaric looked at him. "Now we figure out how to handle this in a way that is worthy of what she did." Cole looked at him. "She did not have to come here," Alaric said. "She came because a treaty required someone, and she was available. That's the whole of why she came, by the council's logic. But she walked in here and she read this compound from the gate, and she spent 4 days finding what was wrong and 1 night fixing it, and she did all of that while hiding the fact that she could do any of it, because hiding it was the safer thing and coming forward was the thing that was necessary." He paused. "I am not going to handle that as though it was simply useful." Cole was quiet for a long moment. "What are you going to do?" "First, I'm going to make sure nothing formal is announced until she's had time to decide what she wants disclosed and on what timeline." He stood. "Then I'm going to make sure she knows that what she did is understood for what it actually was." Cole looked at him with the look of someone who has known a person long enough to recognize when they are in new territory. "All right," Cole said. Alaric went to the river. He went alone, in the full afternoon light, and he stood on the bank where he had stood in the dark the night before, and he looked at the water. It was clear. He had known it would be clear, because he had felt the difference in the ground under his feet in the early hours of the morning. He had felt it when he walked to the healer's building, and when he walked back, and when he stood at the edge of the courtyard watching Owen run. The ground under his compound was connected again, was working again, was doing the thing it was supposed to do for the people and the land above it. He crouched and put his hand on the surface of the water. The current moved around his fingers, cold and steady and continuous. He had been looking in the wrong direction. He had done everything a king was supposed to do, and had been looking in the wrong direction the entire time, and it had taken a woman arriving on a Tuesday with 1 suitcase and 2 paragraphs of council documentation to show him the right one. He thought about what that meant. He had been a king for 6 years. He had been a good king by most measures, by most evidence. He was fair and clear and consistent, and he was honest about what he did not know, and he listened to his beta and his healer, and his senior pack members, and he had worked hard at the job of being responsible for 340 wolves and the land they lived on. But he had not known that the land could be read. He had not known there were people who could put their palms on the ground and hear what was underneath. He had not known that the systems sustaining his territory existed in a form that could be severed and repaired, because nobody in his pack's history had apparently encountered this specific problem before, and so nobody had thought to make sure the knowledge was available. He had a great deal to learn. He was in the presence of someone who could teach him. Not the specific skill. He did not have root sight and was not going to develop it at 29, but the framework, the understanding that there were systems underneath what he could see, that the health of his land was not only about what was visible on its surface, that the connection between pack and territory ran deeper than anyone looking only at the surface would know to check. He stood up from the bank. He looked east, up the river's course, in the direction from which the current came, and from which, if Nara was right, the deer would be returning within 10 days. He walked back to the compound with the particular quality of attention of someone who is seeing a familiar place differently, which is one of the stranger and more useful experiences a person can have. The gates were the same gates. The buildings were the same buildings. The people moving through the grounds were the same people. But the ground under all of it was different from yesterday, and knowing that it was different made everything above it carry a different meaning. He went to find Nara. She was in the small garden near the east wing, sitting on the stone bench in the afternoon light, with her mother's book open on her lap. She was not hiding the book. She looked up when she heard him and waited, which was what she did when she was giving him room to say what he had come to say. He sat beside her on the bench. He told her about his conversation with Cole. He told her that Cole knew and that no one else would be told until she decided what she wanted. He told her about going to the river and the ground feeling different, and Owen in the courtyard. He told her all of it, and then he stopped and looked at the garden. Then he said, "I want to tell you something." She closed the book. "When you arrived," he said, "I was looking in the wrong direction. I had been looking in the wrong direction for 11 days, and I did not know it. Every resource I had was pointed the wrong way, and I did not understand that until you asked one question at a dinner table." He paused. He was looking at the grass at the edge of the garden, which was beginning, at its very tips, to come back green. "I am not telling you this to make you feel that you have earned something. I am telling you because I think you should know that I understand what happened here, not just what you did, what it cost you to decide to do it." She was quiet. He continued looking at the grass. "You arrived in a situation you did not choose. You were selected because you were available. Nobody came to the gate to meet you. Nobody asked you anything about yourself before assigning you a role in an arrangement that was made for reasons that had nothing to do with you as a person." He looked at her. "I am going to spend a long time thinking about what kind of king allows those conditions and what kind of king I intend to be going forward." She held his look, the reading expression, the thorough, careful one, and underneath it something that was doing more than reading, something that was responding. "The first thing," he said, "is that someone is going to meet people at the gate." She looked at him, and then she laughed. It was short and completely genuine, surprised out of her by the specificity of the thing, the laugh of someone who had not built a defense against exactly that kind of direct and practical honesty, because nobody had delivered it in exactly that form before. It was the first time he had heard her laugh. It was a real laugh, not polished, not managed, the actual thing. He thought it was the best thing that had happened in 12 days. The days after the blood moon moved with the specific quality of aftermath, the time after a large thing when the large thing's effects work through everything at their own pace. Owen ran in the courtyard every morning without stopping. Grant, the warrior of 31 years, told Dot on the 5th day that the bond felt full again, not closer or different, full, the way it had always felt before, which he had not known he had stopped feeling until it returned. The healer's building was less busy. The two men near the training ground that Nara had noticed on her first day were no longer speaking in low voices. She could hear actual conversation from them as she passed. The grass came back at the edges first, then moving inward, toward the roots. On the 8th day, Nara went to the river alone in the early morning and stood on the bank and watched the water. Alaric found her there on his morning run, which took him past the eastern boundary as it had taken him past it every morning for years, and he stopped and stood beside her. They looked at the water together, clear and moving and catching the early light. "Good?" he asked. "Good," she said. They stood there for a while. The morning was cold and clear, and the eastern tree line threw long shadows across the meadow, and somewhere in the middle distance a bird was making noise in the way birds made noise when the season was turning and the pressure of spring was building under everything. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Ask." She looked at the river. "When you stood on the bank last night," she said, "the whole night, you could have gone inside at any point. You could have sent someone else to watch. You are the alpha king of this territory, and there were other things you could have reasonably done." She paused. "Why did you stay?" He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Because you were doing something that mattered," he said, "and because someone should have been there to see it, and because I was not going to be the person who walked away from something that mattered because it was cold and late." He looked at her. "And because I suspected, after the dinner table question, that nobody had been there to see any of the things you had done before this, and I thought that should change." She looked at the river for a long moment. "Thank you," she said, the two words carrying more than their surface weight. "You are welcome," he said. "The same." They walked back to the compound together, and the morning was cold, and the grass at the path's edges was beginning, at the very tips, to come green. The deer came back on the 10th day. Nara had known they would. She had said 10 days, and she had meant 10 days. Not approximately 10 days, not within 10 days, but the 10th day specifically, because she knew how land recovered, and she had read the eastern meadow closely enough in the days after the blood moon to be precise about the timeline. But knowing a thing and watching it happen in front of you were different experiences, and she had wanted to see it herself before anyone else, which was why she had gone to the eastern tree line at 5:30 in the morning on the 10th day, in the dark before the full light came, and stood at the edge of the meadow and waited. They came through just as the light was establishing itself, 3 of them, moving with the specific unhurried confidence of animals returning to a place they remembered being good. They stepped out of the tree line on the far side and moved into the meadow grass and began to graze, and Nara stood at her edge of the meadow and watched them, and felt something in her chest that had been tightly held for a long time release a small, careful degree. She stayed until the morning light was full, and the compound behind her was awake, and then she walked back. Alaric came to find her in the garden an hour later. He said the deer, and she said, "I know," and he said 10 days exactly, and she said yes, and they sat on the bench in the garden in the morning light and were quiet together for a while. The garden was in the particular state of early recovery, green at the very edges of the grass, the first returnings. She had been watching it every morning from the window of her room, the way you watch something you have waited for, with the kind of attention that registers even the smallest increments. She had been here 14 days. In 14 days she had arrived at a gate nobody opened, slept in a room nobody explained to her, eaten at a table where she was an arrangement rather than a person, stood in cold water at 3 in the morning while a man she had known for 4 days stood on the bank and did not leave, and repaired a wound in the land that had been killing this pack quietly from the ground up. In 14 days she had not yet figured out what she was doing here, beyond the immediate necessity that had brought her. This was the thing she had not yet addressed, sitting in the garden with Alaric beside her on the bench, and the morning light clear and even. She was here because a treaty required her. The treaty had required an Omega bride, and she had been available, and that had been sufficient. She was bound now, by the ceremony that had taken place 2 days after the river, in which she and Alaric had stood in the main hall in front of the pack's senior members and said the words the protocol required, both of them saying the words with the specific quality of people who were being honest rather than performing a sentiment they did not have. The binding was formal and legal and had the weight of every formal and legal thing. She was, by the record, Queen of Black Crest. She was also a woman sitting on a garden bench in borrowed sunlight, trying to figure out what came next. "I want to tell you something," Alaric said. He had said this before. Once, in the days after the blood moon, when he had told her about the wrong direction and about the gate. That conversation had been the first time she had laughed genuinely in his presence. She had thought about that laugh afterward. She had thought about the fact that it had been surprised out of her, which was the only way real laughter happened, and about what it said that he had produced it. "Tell me," she said. "I want to understand what happened here," he said. "Not just the bond route, the full picture, what you can do, and how it works, and what your mother taught you, and what the book contains." He paused. "Not because I want to categorize it, or manage it, or have it available for use. Because it is yours, and it is significant, and I am sitting next to the person who holds it, and I do not want to sit next to something significant without understanding it." She looked at him. "That will take some time," she said. "I am not going anywhere," he said. She considered this. She had spent 12 years being the only person who held the full weight of what she carried, and 8 months being the only person who held it without her mother to report to, and the weight of it had shaped her in ways she was only beginning to understand now that the shape was being allowed to change. The hiding had been necessary, and the hiding had cost something that hiding always costs, which was the particular loneliness of carrying a thing that you cannot share. He was not asking her to show him a tool. He was asking her to show him herself. "All right," she said, "but it will take time." "I know," he said. She opened her mother's book to the first chapter, which was the introduction her grandmother had written and which contained the foundational framework for everything that followed. She held the book so that he could see the page as well as she could. She began to read, aloud, the way her mother had first read it to her when she was old enough to understand what the words were describing. The morning moved around them. Other people passed through the garden, pack members on their way to various morning tasks, children with the specific directedness of children who have somewhere they want to be, Petra with a clipboard, and the hurried walk of someone who had a great many things to accomplish before noon. All of them gave a slight acknowledgement to the alpha and his new queen sitting on the bench, and then they went on, because the compound had things to do, and the things to do did not wait for the significant conversations happening in the garden. Nara read the introduction. Then she explained what the introduction had not explained in its formal language, which was the felt experience of root sight, what it was like to use it, and what it cost, and what it could and could not do. She explained the difference between root sight and healing. She explained the bond root system as her grandmother had diagrammed it in the margins of the 3rd chapter. The way it ran through a territory at depth, the way it connected to the pack members above it, the way the connection strengthened over generations of habitation until it was as intrinsic and as taken for granted as the ground itself. He listened. He asked 2 questions, both of them specific, and both of them indicating that he was building a framework as she spoke, rather than simply recording information. She noted this. She had not expected him to build frameworks in real time. She was revising several things about what she had expected. "The severance," he said. "How did it happen? Do you know yet?" She had been thinking about this since the night of the repair. "Not with certainty," she said. "The break was clean in a specific way. Not natural deterioration, not gradual strain. Something acute happened at that location 6 weeks ago. An impact of some kind. At depth. It could have been seismic, though there were no recorded tremors in the area at that time." She paused. "It could have been deliberate." He was quiet. "I do not know that it was deliberate," she said quickly. "I want to be clear about that. I know that the break had the qualities of a sharp impact rather than gradual failure. What caused the impact, I cannot say from the evidence I have." "Can you find out?" She considered. "Possibly. With time and access to the eastern boundary. The root bond has been reconnected, but the site of the severance would still carry the signature of whatever caused it. It would be like looking at scar tissue. You can see the shape of the wound even after it has healed." He nodded slowly. "I want to know," he said, "when you're ready." She nodded. She had expected him to want to know. It was the right question. In the weeks that followed, the compound returned to itself, in the incremental way of things returning after damage. Not all at once, not with drama. The grass came fully green, the deer stayed in the eastern meadow, and their numbers grew as the season progressed. The warrior Grant came to Alaric on the third week and said, in his direct and unceremonious way, that he wanted to tell the king what the land felt like now compared to what it had felt like for the past 6 weeks, because he thought the king should know the difference between a pack living on connected land and a pack living on dying land, and he wanted to be useful in helping communicate that. Alaric thanked him and they talked for an hour, and afterward Alaric found Nara and told her what Grant had said, and she listened with the attention she gave everything. The pack learned about her gradually, which was the way she had wanted it, and which Alaric had respected. She did not announce herself. She did not ask for recognition. She continued to eat in the dining room and walk in the compound and speak to the pack members she encountered with the composure that was her natural register. And slowly, in the way of communities that pay attention to their own, people began to understand that something had changed and to connect that change to the woman who had arrived at the gate with one suitcase 2 weeks before the change. Dot was the first to ask directly. She came to Nara in the garden one afternoon and said, "I don't entirely understand what you did, but I have been watching Owen run every morning and I wanted to tell you that." "You helped," Nara said. "Your records made the pattern clear." Dot looked at her for a moment. "What you did is not something I have a name for in any of the books I have." "No," Nara said. "There aren't many books about it." "Could you teach it?" Nara considered. "Not the site itself. No, that comes with the bloodline. But the framework, what the bond root system is, how it works, what the signs of its failure look like from the outside, what to watch for." She paused. "Yes, I could teach that." Dot nodded. "Good," she said. "Then let's plan for that." Nara looked at Dot with something that was not quite surprise, but was in the vicinity of it. She had not expected the question. She had not expected the practicality of the offer, the clean transition from "there is a thing you know" to "we should make sure that knowledge is not only in your head." She had been living alone with this knowledge for long enough that the concept of sharing it in a formal, planned, instructional way had not yet arranged itself in her mind. "Yes," she said, "let's plan for that." She told Alaric about the conversation that evening. They were in his study, which she had started to inhabit in the evenings when the day's formal demands were done, and the compound had gone quiet, sitting across from each other at the desk, with the reports she had begun to read alongside him. He had not suggested she read the reports. He had simply placed them on the desk in a way that included the space she occupied, and she had begun to read them, and neither of them had said anything about it because it had not required saying anything. He listened to her account of the Dot conversation and then said, "Good, that's exactly the right direction." "You think so?" "I think the knowledge should not live only in one person," he said. "I think your mother was working against conditions that made that the only safe option. Those conditions don't have to be the same here." She looked at him. "That is easier to say than to do." "I know," he met her look. "But it's where we're starting from." She thought about her mother. Her mother had been the most careful person she had ever known, and the most thorough, and she had been right about almost everything except the thing she could not have predicted, which was the specific compound and the specific king where Nara would end up. Her mother had prepared her for a world that was less trustworthy than this one was turning out to be, which was not a failure of preparation, but an excess of caution born from love, and Nara did not fault her for it, and did not intend to live inside it anymore. She was going to teach what she knew. She was going to work with Dot on the framework. She was going to go back to the eastern boundary when she was ready, and read the scar of the severance, and find out what she could about what had caused it. She was going to stay in the compound of the Black Crest Pack, which was the largest pack territory in the northern region, and which had very recently almost ceased to be a viable territory at all, and she was going to be part of its continued being viable, not because a treaty had placed her here, and not because a ceremony had made it formal, but because the ground under this compound was connected, and she could feel that when she walked on it, and the work of keeping it connected was the work of a lifetime, and she was beginning to think, in the right place for that work. "I want to go back to the eastern boundary," she said, "in a few days, to read the scar." "I'll come with you," he said immediately. She looked at him. "You don't need to." "I know," he said. "I want to." She thought about the bank. About 4 hours in the cold, and his hand on her back, and the word "still here" delivered in the dark at close range. She thought about all the years she had done things alone, because there was no one who knew what she was doing, and therefore no one who could meaningfully come along, and about the specific difference between that and this. "All right," she said. Outside, the evening was settling over the compound. She could hear the sounds of the pack in its nighttime mode, the particular texture of a large group of people winding down, and underneath it, the silence of the eastern boundary, which was not the silence of absence anymore, but the silence of something fully present and not needing to announce itself. Connected land was quiet in a specific way. She had been taught to hear the difference, and she had been hearing it for 2 weeks now, every morning when she went to the window and every evening when she walked in the garden. The quiet of a system working rather than a system failing, and it was the quietest, most continuous sound she had known. They went to the eastern boundary 4 days later, as she had said. They went in the early morning, before the compound's day had fully started, when the light was still making up its mind, and the eastern meadow held the specific emptiness of early hours. She found the scar on the riverbed without difficulty. It was there in the way scars are there, legible to root sight even after the wound had closed, the specific signature of whatever had caused the break still present in the substrate. She read it for a long time. He stood on the bank, because he had understood, without her needing to explain it, that reading it required the same quality of concentration as the repair, and that the bank was where he belonged. When she came up from the reading, she stood in the shallow edge of the water and looked east for a moment before turning to him. "I know what caused it," she said. He was very still. "An instrument," she said. "Not natural. Something was driven into the ground at this location, at depth, with enough force, and with the specific qualities, to sever a bond root." She paused. "It was removed afterward. It is not here anymore. But the signature is clear." She looked at him. "Someone did this deliberately." He said nothing for a moment. "Can you describe the instrument?" he asked. His voice was level in the way of someone who has received alarming information and is applying the discipline of not responding to the alarm before having the full picture. "Not precisely. I can describe its characteristics. The diameter, the composition, approximately, the angle of entry." She paused. "I need to read it further before I can say more, but I can say that this was not an accident, and it was not a natural event." He nodded once. He was thinking, she could see him thinking, and he was thinking in the organized way of someone who has just received a problem and is beginning to build the approach to it. "When you're ready to go back," he said, "I want Cole with us." "Yes," she said. "That's right." They stood on the bank of the clear eastern river in the early morning light, which moved on the surface of the water and was thrown back. The meadow behind them was full of early grass, and somewhere in the eastern range the deer were moving. The compound behind them was in its morning activity, the sounds of 340 wolves living on land that was connected and working and sustaining them. She had been here for 18 days. She had arrived at a gate nobody opened, and she had stood at that gate and put her fingers in the soil and begun, in that moment, to understand what was underneath all of it. She had found the wound and repaired it, and she had done it while a man she had known for 4 days stood on a bank in the cold and did not leave, and now she was standing at the same river in the morning light of a different day, knowing more about what had made the wound than she had known the morning after she healed it, and the knowing meant there was more work ahead. Good, she thought. She had not been sent here for a political arrangement, though a political arrangement was what had brought her. She had been sent here by the same thing that had pointed her grandmother toward broken land and her mother toward the territories that needed quiet, unpublicized repair. She had been pointed here by something that was older than any treaty and that had nothing to do with availability. She had been pointed here because the ground needed reading, and she was the one who could read it, and because the man who was responsible for this ground was the kind of man who stood on a bank in 39-degree water and said "still here" and meant it. That was sufficient. More than sufficient. She stepped out of the shallow edge of the water onto the bank. He offered his hand and she took it, not because she needed help getting up the bank, but because it was offered, and because accepting it was not weakness, and because 12 years of hiding had taught her to refuse things that were not refusing worthy, and she was done with that. They walked back through the eastern tree line together. The compound gate was latched, as it had been latched every day for the past 2 weeks, the new latch bright on the old gate. She touched it as she passed, the reflex of someone checking, and it held. She smiled, which was not something she did often, and which Alaric, walking beside her, noticed, and filed away in the same way she filed everything, for consideration later. "What?" he said. "The gate," she said. He looked at it. Then he looked at her. "First thing," he said. "First thing," she agreed. They went inside, into the compound, into the sounds and the morning and the work of another day, in a place that was alive and connected, and for the first time in 6 weeks, entirely itself. The loose gate was latched. The river ran clear. The deer grazed in the eastern meadow, and the woman who had arrived at the gate with her fingers already reaching for the soil of it was home.